Hi, today I'm going to talk about a recent podcast with Peter Boghossian and David Packman, and I want to focus on the way that they're defining political ideologies, especially within the context of American politics.
You mentioned something I want to talk about. You mentioned on the left, and I've been having a lot of trouble with what that means. I think I take Andrew Doyle's position that's I've been saying for a while. I'm not really sure what that means. I'm not sure if that's helpful either. Not even a heuristic. So what does that mean to be on the left? Like, is there a defining characteristic or a suite of propositions one believes if one is on the left?
It depends on where on the left you are, so I can kind of speak to where I am. But I do think it's worth, you've mentioned something that's actually maybe the most interesting thing, which is this left-right spectrum thing, just like a binary that goes, just like a line, and where are you on the line? It is not robust enough, I believe, especially right now, to really describe people's political views. I think a
Yeah.
better way, now I still use it because I want to be understood. And if I start using a different system and people go, I don't even know what you're talking about, I just won't be understood. So we'll get back to that. I
Okay.
think a better framework is if we think about it as a four quadrant matrix, where we are looking at social liberalism versus conservatism kind of on one axis, and then authoritarian libertarian on another axis.
Huh.
And so
Okay.
you could be an economic libertarian and a social conservative, and that would put you in one quadrant. I think that's definitely more robust. So, like for me, I tend to libertarianism, small L, not the Libertarian Party, but just my default is don't involve the government unless we have a good reason to do so. I think in some areas, like healthcare, we have a good reason to do so. So I would
So I think this is a very interesting start, at least, instead of just thinking about the binary polarization that we often find. People talk about left versus right, or liberal conservative, or Democrat Republican. And often they're not clearly defining these characteristics. And what happens is we just have a polarized discourse, a splitting between these two different sides, but the sides don't line up. Left, right doesn't equal conservative, liberal, doesn't equal necessarily Republican, Democrat. And so I think it's important to try to make these distinctions. Now, Packman starts off by saying there's four different distinctions he wants to look at, and I think that's a start, but I would argue that there's actually eight major ideologies, and that we have to look at how they are different and how they connect with each other. So the eight main ideologies that I want to articulate are left, right, liberal, conservative, but also authoritarian, traditional, and center right, center left. So I'll get more into how these eight different ideologies are defined, but I think it's very important to make these distinctions. Otherwise, people have the illusion that they're understanding each other and that they're referencing reality, but really they're just using this very faulty, simplistic, binary logic that makes it seem like they're understanding each other, but really they're misunderstanding each other.
libertarian on that scale and a social liberal where gay marriage, I don't care, do whatever you want. So I think that the four quadrant system is better. A lot of people still just kind of say left and right. So working within left and right, I'm a social democrat. And so for me, I'm worried about disproportionate power of moneyed interests over society. I think that
I
that
like
is
that.
something.
Sorry to interrupt. I like that. I like that. I'm worried about. I like that. I like that. I like that. Okay, so tell me what you're worried about.
So one of the things to understand here is that I would put Peter Boghossian on the center right. And this is kind of a discourse that is very popular on online media, podcasts, YouTube. And it's often people like Bill Maher who claim that they're liberals, that they're just, oh, they want open discourse, they want free speech, that they're against the extreme left, the extreme right, and they especially focus on what they see as left-wing wokeism and identity politics and transgender politics. Um, but really, they're desire to be seen as just neutral, scientific, factual, liberal is hiding their true investment in a right-wing politics and right-wing ideology. And so Peter Boghossian is a great example of that. At times he says, oh, he's a Democrat, but he doesn't believe in the left or the extreme left. But he's constantly having on his shows extreme right-wing people, and he really does fuel the whole kind of MAGA right-wing discourse. And but he still wants to pretend that he's just kind of an aggrieved liberal who lost his academic job or walked away from his academic job. And but his obsession with identity politics, with transgender rights, with various what he sees as left-wing extremism shows that his true colors are that he's really a right-winger libertarian who's hiding under the cover of being just a liberal Democrat.
That tells a lot about one's political leanings, what they're concerned about.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the really big differences is the right would put as a much higher concern government involvement in stuff. Whereas I think generally on the left, we're more worried not primarily about government involvement, but about systems and structures that predispose to unfairness and inequality. These aren't absolutes, but I think like very top level, that would be one way to kind of enter the discussion of what it means to be left and right. But I can,
So once again, he's forcing his discussion back into the simple binary after he said that there should be at least four different variables and that it's too simplistic and reductive just to say left, right. But what he's pointing to is this general tendency of people on the right blaming the government for all the problems and people on the left blaming capitalism for all of the problems. And certain on a certain level, that's partially true, but the problem is there's other ideologies that are important to look at. And once you reduce everything to this simple binary, that it becomes really impossible to do a clear analysis.
again, I just think left right spectrum is mostly too simplistic for anything but the most simple conversations.
Yeah, the only advantage I can think of, and I'm not being facetious when I say this, is it doesn't have many syllables, so it's kind of quick to get out. You know,
An advantage.
yeah, I've been, I left Hungary for a bit and I'm back in Hungary right now. Sorry, people always call my fold my arms. I'm nursing a horrible shoulder injury while I keep re-injuring it. But when you talk to conservatives here, and I interface with a lot of liberals and conservatives, mostly conservatives, maybe a 70-30 split.
So it's interesting, once again, this return to the left, right, but that he spends a lot of time in Hungary. He gets a certain amount of funding from Hungary. So clearly he has a tolerance, at least, for authoritarian governments. And he seems to have no problem with Orban and the current Hungarian regime. In fact, he's being funded by them. And so, in many ways, he's an apologist for this authoritarian ideology.
Think tank fellows, public intellectuals, etc., universally, and I can sincerely tell you this with complete honesty, and because I've explicitly asked them, what do you think about Trump's Ukraine policy? And they've even there's no secret. I'm affiliated with the Danube Institute, and they're baffled by it. But conservatives here are confused. They don't understand it. They're worried about its escalation. They're worried that the Russians will, Poles have now enacted conscription. Other Eastern European countries are talking about it. Macron's talking about this is old news.
So, another signal often that someone is on the center right or on the right or has authoritarian tendencies is that they don't think it's worth the fight against Russia and Putin to defend Ukraine, and that they're skeptical of the European Union, of Europe in general, And so we have this once again this idea like wants to portray himself as being liberal, open, democratic, and yet he is kind of continuously returning to his, first of all, investment in an authoritarian government like Hungary, but also like his desire to say like we should, you know, rethink our commitment to Ukraine and fighting Russia.
Talking about rearmament, the United States Trump has talked about, well, explicitly and repeatedly talked about, I don't know if he's going to do it, but withdrawing from NATO or NATO is useless. Europeans are going to have to pay for their own defense. So I mention that only because that's not the right of yore. That's not the Soviet Union, the Russians were the bad guys. That's not, it also strikes me as very interesting that people seem to forget that Ukraine is in Europe. You know, there will never be another war in Europe. What do you think Ukraine is? But, but I don't know. I don't see, I see maybe European conservatism, if we can even use that, as distinct on a number of issues from American conservatism. And I wonder if you comment on that.
I think that that's probably right. I mean, my I'm not an expert on European conservatism, but from the folks I've spoken to, interviewed, and what I've read, it seems as though, other than the nationalist right of Europe, which I don't think it's at its peak now, I think it was at its peak maybe in 21 and it started to decline actually to some degree, but other than the ultra nationalist European right, it seems as though there's more of an adherence to the more traditional conservative ideas in Europe that have been mostly abandoned, certainly by MAGA in the United States. You know, you've got like a Rand Paul and a Thomas Massie, like I mentioned, who still are sort of sticking to that in the US, but MAGA has become a completely different thing. So it seems to me that
Yeah.
exempting the ultranationalist European right, the right of Europe is more aligned with what maybe like a Reagan or even a George W. Bush were.
So I think this is very interesting. Packman kind of showing his ignorance here, and I'm not sure what motivates it. But we do find this common story now that the Republicans used to be more moderate or classically conservative, and that MAGA or Trump is something completely different. But if you really look at the different major policies, um, MAGA is in many ways just a continuation and intensification of what's already been happening in the Republican Party, especially, you know, since Reagan. Not only this connection with the religious fundamentalists for political purposes, but this kind of hyper nationalism combined with kind of a promotion of an anti-left, anti-democratic discourse. We'll hear more about it, but there is this false mythology that the Republicans used to be kind of mainstream, moderate, um, and very different from MAGA or Trump. But in many ways, Trump is just the kind of realization of the goals of Reagan and Bush.
Yeah, and Reed and I just did a spectrum street epistemology for whether or not MAGA is Republican and MAGA is conservative. And we did it with conservatives, Rod Dreher, Melissa O'Sullivan, Deputy Director of the Daniel Institute, among other people. And there was a wide scale disagreement among them about what MAGA was, whether it was conservative, whether it was Republican, whether it was an entirely a different beast. Okay, so you have written a book that Reed will pull up here. And I want,
So, just to further clarify, I think what is being hidden in this kind of misrepresentation of the Republican Party, starting with Reagan, moving on to Bush, and now to Trump, is that guiding the Republican Party has been this tax revolt from above, this desire to fight against taxation, especially for wealthy people, to justify that by demonizing the government, to justify the demonization of the government by saying, like, oh, it's just to help people of color and that we no longer have prejudice or racism. So there has been a very kind of consistent pattern within the Republican Party over the last 40 years, and starting especially with Nixon, the Southern strategy to find a way to appeal to racist voters without directly being racist or seeing yourself as racist, and to use all of this discourse to justify the cutting the taxes to the wealthy, deregulation of businesses, cutting corporate taxes as really the main like driving force, the libertarian ideology behind the right.
Ask you, the book is The Echo Machine, How Right-Wing Extremism Created a Post-Truth America. So can we please start by defining some of these terms? What do you mean by right? Now that we know what you mean by right, what makes an extremist? And then if you could please define post-truth.
Yeah, I mean, so post-truth is simpler. It's just that empirical facts no longer matter or serve as a basis for where conversations start. We've got a misunderstanding as to what sorts of statements are even statements of fact versus statements of opinion. I delve into the research
Right.
on that in the book. This kind of shared basis where we can disagree on policy, but we're starting with the facts and then we argue about the policy, that's kind of gone. Where now we are even just trying to say, what sorts of statements count as fact? And I think that that's a very difficult place to even get to policy from, and maybe we'll get back to that. In terms of right-wing extremism, to go, this links to the last thing you said, which is I don't believe there's anything conservative about MAGA and the forces that have taken over the Republican Party right now. I see it more as a sort of reactionary anarcho-libertarianism, and that's a lot, and we could delve into that. But just to, fiscal conservatism would be one way to say at one point the Republican Party was basically fiscal conservatism.
Oh, they're definitely not that now.
So the question is, when was the Republican Party really super concerned about deficit or fiscally conservative? If you look at Reagan, huge deficit. You look at Bush, huge deficit. Um, and then this question of when did we move into this post-fact era? Well, clearly, like Bush, the invasion of Iraq, justified by a series of false representations of lies. Reagan's whole attack on the government, often fueled by, these myths, like the myth of the welfare queen. So, the Republican Party has been post-fact for a long time. Now, it might become more extreme with Trump and with new forms of social media, but this has been like an inherent part of the Republican Party since Nixon and probably, further back. And so it's strange that all of a sudden they want to argue that there's this break between Reagan and Bush on one side and Trump on the other side, so that suddenly all of the problem is Trump and it's not this inherent social movement on the right, which is reactionary, which is libertarian, which is anti-government, anti-tax, anti-welfare state. This has been a consistent, ideology for 50, 60 years. And they're pretending now that, oh no, suddenly it's Trump who's invented it or has pushed it forward, and it's been fueled by this new form of media, when in reality it's been a dominant form of ideology in the United States since Nixon. So it's very interesting that they want to create this false mythology, and partially it is falling back on this left-right binary splitting. The other part is they want to just focus on Trump as this aberration. So Packman is, I would say, center left, and Boghossian is center right, and yet they're kind of bonding over this shared misrepresentation of the Republican Party.
Not that now.
Yeah.
So I think that it's become this kind of reactionary anarcho-libertarian movement. And by extremism, extremism is relative to everything else, right? Whether something is extreme has to do with where is the middle and sort of what would it mean to be moderate. And then relative to that, you think about what does it mean to be extreme.
Okay, hold on. I want to linger on this before my jet lagged mind loses it. So if the idea is that the Republicans, or at least MAGA, I don't know how you want to say it, this incarnation of the Republican Party has gone debt crazy or not concerned about the debt, would that mean that they do that because they're anarcho-libertarians and they want to bring about an anarchy? Or they do that because of a casual indifference to the debt?
I think it's the latter. I mean, the book talks a lot about the debt and deficit thing. And one of the things that I've identified is even the supposedly strongest held principles right now within the MAGA Republican Party are no longer so important once they become politically inconvenient. And there's a lot of examples we could give, but debt and
But clearly, the Republican Party, for a very long period of time before Trump, would talk about the deficit and other conservative principles and then do the opposite for decades. And so the party has always been opportunistic because it also has to be fundamentally deceitful because it's really the attempt of the super wealthy to increase their power and their wealth, but they have to hide that and they have to also get people who are suffering because of this concentration of wealth and this attack on the government and this loss of tax revenue. They have to get those people that are suffering from this to actually support them. So the whole movement is post fact and a manipulation of mythologies in order to hide like the true intent, which is that a small group of people using the government for their benefit and taking advantage of the government through subsidies and tax breaks and through getting rid of regulations and enabling monopolies. They have to hide all of that. And so they do it in several different ways. But one of the main ways that they do it is through this kind of mythologizing of the Republican Party of the past. And I think it's interesting that Packman, once again, who's center left, feeds into this and doesn't realize that his desire to see this radical break between Trump and what happened before in the Republican Party, it actually just feeds into the Republican strategy.
deficit is a good one where there's this kind of claim placating the idea that we must balance the budget and we need to get a surplus so that we can start paying down the national debt. Trump said in his first term he would have the national debt paid off. Of course, it actually got bigger rather than smaller. And
Correct.
so
That's factually true.
the principle that we need to prioritize always fiscal responsibility as defined by reducing the deficit as soon as they want the golden dome defense system, which is the new thing, or tax cuts for the rich, or whatever the case may be, things that will increase the deficit. They go, actually, that wasn't quite so important. We care more about this other thing. And you can apply that to business regulation. You can apply that to the concepts of freedom and liberty. These principles that they claim to hold very dear become very unimportant when they are politically inconvenient.
So one of the problems for the Republican Party is if it wants to say that it is fiscally conservative, but also it wants to have tax cuts and also it wants to have a strong military. You can't have all these things at the same time. And so it has to constantly lie about what it's doing. For instance, the Trump spokesperson, like openly said like that this budget will not increase the deficit, which is everyone says is completely wrong. It will have a massive increase in the deficit. But because they want to cater to these mutually opposing ideologies and also supporters, they have to constantly just lie and circulate misinformation and myths and conspiracy theories because it's absolutely impossible for them to say the truth about virtually anything that they're doing because it's contradictory and also because they're trying to hide their true intentions.
I have a hard time comprehending this. Why?
Well, you're saying why do they claim that they really care about these principles and then abandon them?
Yeah, at one level, and another level, why don't they actually really care about the principles and then discharge those through policy?
Why they don't really care about them, you'd have to ask them. That I don't know. My interpretation is there's a need to put together some apparently coherent set of beliefs in order to justify your existence as a political. So they go,
So instead of saying, well, they're just cynical opportunists who are taking advantage of people and trying to manipulate people in order to get their way and in order to win elections so that they can, have tax cuts and deregulation, they have to appeal, say, to religious fundamentalists and say like they care about abortion or care about religious freedom and religious rights, and they also have to show that they're nationalists, even though they're really global capitalists, multinational capitalists who really don't fundamentally care about what nation they're in. Um, there's a bunch of structural contradictions and oppositions which prevent them from actually, sticking to any of their supposed principles and beliefs and moralities. I mean, just the fact that you have the most like amoral person, Trump, being supported overwhelmingly by Christian fundamentalists that are hypermoral, supposedly, shows that the whole system is based on this contradictory bringing together of two opposite ideologies. The libertarian, free individual, free market, free speech versus the authoritarian Christian fundamentalist who wants a strict moral order, who wants to censor speech, who wants to have the individual submit to a higher power. There's a fundamental opposition there. And then you throw in this idea of conservative concern about debt, about the future. That's a whole nother ideology. And so each political party is just a coalition of different and often opposing ideologies. And but they pretend like they're part of like one coherent group. But if you look at their different policies that they endorse, they don't actually line up into a coherent whole.
we're for fiscal responsibility is defined by reducing the deficit. We're for low regulation, so on and so forth. Because otherwise, you're not offering anything. You've got to offer something. The truth is,
Yeah,
what they're
yeah.
really about is, at least the MAGA prism, is what's good for Trump and his friends. When what's good for Trump and his friends conflicts with these principles, well, they get away from the principles because they never really mattered. I see those principles more as a ruse than anything else.
So once again, focusing on Trump and his friends, I think in a way that is partially correct that Trump is hyper focused on what benefits him personally and maybe the people that he associates with. But this has been going on within the Republican Party for decades. If you think about the main goal is to lower taxes on the wealthy, to deregulate their businesses, to attack the welfare state as a way of justifying cutting taxes. Um, that this has been going on for such a long time. It's just interesting why I would say like center left people like Packman want to focus on Trump as an individual and not look at this larger, broader historical, political, ideological movement. There is this kind of idea that on some level the center left is obsessed about signaling their virtue, and by finding someone that they can attack and show their moral superiority to. So even if so much of what Trump is doing is morally reprehensible, the question is like, why does someone like Packman want to focus on him and not on the party itself, on this larger movement, on this long historical process? Is it just that it's an easy target? Is it that he can clearly show his moral superiority by a strict kind of opposition between Trump and everyone else? it's interesting that there's this desire in a way to kind of like neglect the fact that the Republican Party is supporting Trump, that all these people in Congress are doing whatever Trump wants for the most. And so that you can't just look at Trump. Clearly, you have to look at the whole party, and you just can't look at the present. You have to look at this long history, and you can't just look at one ideology. You have to look at the combination of ideologies.
Yeah, you're right, by the way. I'm sorry I asked you that question. I should, I am guilty of what I criticize NPR for. I should ask somebody who supports the principles as opposed to you who doesn't support those principles. So I apologize for that. Okay, so who is more responsible for post-truth? Is it the right-wing extremism or left-wing extremism, the right or the left or what? Who
Well,
is
listen,
responsible?
I have a perspective. My perspective is that the right is more responsible for it. If you have, right-wing viewers and listeners, my guess is that they will disagree with me at least to some degree. I don't think the left is blameless here. And in fact, in the book, I devote an entire section to criticizing this kind of postmodern, everybody's truth is just as valid thing that has taken place on the fringes of the left. I'm against that. I'm against identity politics on the left. I'm against
I
the
would say, I would push back and say far more than.
So another ideological issue is this notion that the left is for moral relativism or believes like there's no way of having a truth or morality, and that this is a part of identity politics. Like clearly, identity politics on the left is about being committed to a certain perspective, a certain morality, a certain view of reality. And so people confuse, I think, the postmodern relativism philosophy with left-wing politics. And they also don't even understand what postmodernism is. In many ways, postmodernism is more of a cultural, artistic, literary phenomenon of dealing a lot with irony or the inconsistency of language. It's really, it's not left-wing politics and it's not moral relativism. And so I think that the right often wants to represent postmodernism as a form of cultural Marxism. And these are just the confusion of different categories, but it's a way of simply attacking the left. And one reason why they want to demonize the left is because that helps the Republican Party create this coalition between the libertarian right and the Christian fundamentalist authoritarians, and also the conservatives. And so, as a form of coalition building, having this common enemy that you can demonize, the postmodern Marxist left, identity politics, transgender rights, it's just a way of defining your group by having a common enemy and seeing yourself as like the opposite of this false enemy that you've created. And for some reason, like Packman once again kind of feeds into this right-wing framing of the issue by also trying to demonize postmodernism. So I think that we see in just this short interaction and exchange between someone on the center right and someone on the center left, a series of kind of shared misrepresentations and mythologies, and that as much as Packman wants a more kind of nuanced, complex understanding of ideological conflict, he tends to fall back into these mythologies, these binary splittings, these kind of like simple representations, because after all, he is someone who makes his money by having viewers and by catering to a certain perspective and to giving his audience what they want. And so he needs to remain, popular in his area by representing a very simplistic, unnuanced discourse that ends up in this type of culture to like really feed the right because you're kind of feeding this kind of simplified binary worldview. And it's once again like white males just talking endlessly from a non-expert perspective and saying like that they're promoting free speech or libertarian ideology, when in reality it does feed like the right and undermine other ideologies.